Chapter 2. As the sun set behind the palace, casting a warm glow over its regal facade, Queen Gabriella found herself alone in her chambers once again. Her reign as queen had barely begun, yet she was already drowning beneath the weight of her responsibilities. Every day, her advisors bombarded her with tedious meetings, trivial disputes, and endless paperwork. "Your Majesty, you must sign these treaties," they'd say, or "Please review this budget proposal," always demanding more and more of her time, never offering encouragement or understanding. They seemed to forget that their queen was still a young woman, thrust into a role she was unprepared for after the sudden death of her parents. Gabriella needed support, a kind word, or even just a pat on the back, but all she received from her advisors was an ever-growing mountain of duties. Gabriella stared at her reflection in the mirror as she adjusted the heavy crown atop her head. She felt her shoulders droop beneath its weight and pushed out a weary sigh. Turning away from the glass, she moved to the nearby decanter and placed a large crystal goblet beneath its spout. Filling the cup until it brimmed over with deep burgundy liquid, she took a long sip and felt the warmth of its sweet taste spread through her body. Her visits to the decanter became more frequent and for larger amounts of time, and soon her glass was no longer filled with wine, but rather with whiskey, then brandy, and eventually stronger intoxicants. The relief they brought was fleeting, though, leaving behind an emptiness that only intensified her search for something that could truly make her forget. "Gabriella, please, you have to stop drinking like this," Denise pleaded as they sat together in Gabriella's private salon. The scent of expensive perfumes lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of alcohol. Gabriella clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought back tears. Denise had been her best friend since childhood, and though they had shared many happy memories, their friendship now teetered on the edge, threatened by the darkness consuming the young queen. "Denise, I don't know how to be queen," Gabriella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need something to help me forget, to ease my angst, even if it's only for a moment." "Gabby, I worry about you," Denise confessed. "But I'll stand by your side, no matter what. We'll find a way to get through this together." Gabriella's downward spiral seemed to reach its peak with each passing day, making it harder for the two friends to relate as they once did. Denise no longer heard the carefree laughter that filled the air when they were together, and instead watched Gabriella wiping away tears from her cheeks after hushed arguments. Despite knowing she was putting herself at risk, Denise refused to abandon her beloved queen in her time of need. "Please, Gabriella, let me help you. There are other ways to escape," Denise implored, her hand reaching out to grasp the shaking fingers of her friend. Gabriella hesitated for a moment, then squeezed Denise's hand in return, seeking solace and understanding in the touch of another human being. "Gabriella!" Denise's voice echoed through the vast, empty halls of the palace, pulling the young queen back to reality. Loneliness had long since become Gabriella's constant companion, and the sudden intrusion of another person, particularly one so dear to her, sparked a familiar ache in her chest. "Denise!" Gabriella exclaimed, springing from her throne. "I've missed you so much." She crossed the room, embracing her friend tightly as tears welled up in her eyes. Denise returned the embrace, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your Majesty, I've missed you too," Denise said softly, stepping back to look Gabriella in the eye. "But we can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Someone might see us." Gabriella nodded, already devising a plan to sneak Denise and her friends into the palace under the watchful eyes of her advisors. "There's a feast tonight," she said, an impish grin spreading across her face. "We'll use that as our diversion." Gabriella reluctantly stepped away from her friends, careful not to be noticed. She tiptoed into the kitchen, skimming the countertops for supplies. After grabbing a small white candle and a sheet of paper, with precise movements, Gabriella set up the makeshift fiery distraction, silently counting down in her head until it would go off. Likely in a few hours, she thought. Creating an escape route for her and her friends to have some fun on their own. Then she quickly made her way back to the living room. As night fell, the palace buzzed with activity. The air was rich with the scent of freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and fragrant spices. Gabriella, dressed in a shimmering gown, took her place at the head of the table, her heart pounding in anticipation. Across the hall, guests began to stream in, their laughter and conversation filling the room. "Your Majesty," an advisor whispered in her ear, "it's time." Nodding, Gabriella raised her goblet, signaling for the feast to begin. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Denise and her friends. When she spotted them, cleverly disguised as members of the royal court, relief washed over her like a balm. For the first time in months, Gabriella allowed herself to relax, enjoying the simple pleasure of being surrounded by people who cared for her. "Denise," she whispered, leaning in close to her friend, "I can't thank you enough for being here." "Anything for you, Gabriella," Denise replied, smiling warmly, "but we must be careful. Your advisors are watching." The evening progressed, and as the feast wore on, Gabriella's advisors grew increasingly suspicious of the unfamiliar faces in their midst. They whispered amongst themselves, casting wary glances at the young queen and her companions. In her eagerness to escape her loneliness, Gabriella had inadvertently put everyone at risk. An alarm rang out from the direction of the kitchen, and a servant rushed out at an urgent pace. "Your Majesty," he mumbled, barely loud enough to be heard over the sound of the celebration. "There's been an accident in the kitchen. One of the chefs has been burned." Gabriella's heart sank, realizing that her diversion had come at a cost. She nodded solemnly, dismissing the servant to tend to the injured cook. As he disappeared into the bustling crowd, Gabriella caught sight of Denise's concerned expression. "Denise, I hurt someone," Gabriella whispered, guilt gnawing at her insides. "This is all my fault." "Gabriella, you couldn't have known," Denise reassured her, placing a comforting hand on the young queen's arm. "Accidents happen. Let's just get out of here and enjoy the rest of the night, okay?" As the feast continued, Gabriella couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over her like a thick fog. The consequences of her addiction, of her desperation for connection, weighed heavily on her heart. And though she longed for the comfort of her friends and the numbing embrace of alcohol, she knew that she could not afford to indulge any further. Not when the lives of those working in the building hung in the balance. She needed something else than alcohol. Denise hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the outline of the small plastic bag she held concealed in her palm. She glanced around the dimly lit chamber, filled with the scent of burning candles and the sound of laughter from Gabriella's other friends, who had gathered for this secret rendezvous. "Are you sure about this?" Denise asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the pounding music that filled the room, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that usually enveloped the palace. Gabriella nodded, her eyes full of desperation. "I need it, Denise. It's either this or alcohol, and I just can't." "Okay," Denise relented, reluctantly handing over the illicit substance. She watched as Gabriella greedily snorted the powder, her chest heaving with a mix of anticipation and dread. "Denise, thank you," Gabriella whispered, her body trembling as the drug coursed through her veins. "You don't know how much this means to me." "Of course, Gabby," Denise replied, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Just be careful. This is strong stuff, okay? We can't afford any more accidents." But even as the words left her lips, Denise knew the danger they all faced. Gabriella's addiction, once a secret shared only between the two of them, was now threatening to consume everyone in its path. And yet, despite the risks, Denise couldn't bring herself to turn away from her friend, not when she was so clearly in pain. As the minutes ticked by, Gabriella's laughter grew louder and more reckless, now drinking again, her inhibitions slipping away under the influence of alcohol. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocated by the weight of their collective guilt. Gabriella now turned to her little bag of escape, just a small sniff that would make in very thing perfect. She sniffed the substance and felt her body relax. "Oh my God," she thought, "I'm being carried by angels." "Gabriella, maybe you should lie down," one of her friends suggested nervously, watching as the young queen swayed unsteadily on her feet. "I'm fine," Gabriella insisted, her voice slurring slightly. "I just need a moment to catch my breath." But as she stumbled toward the ornate couch that dominated one corner of the room, Gabriella's legs gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor. Denise's heart clenched with terror as she watched her friend convulse violently, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "Gabriella!" Denise shouted as she rushed to her side. She inspected Gabriella's face frantically, searching for any signs of life while her smudged lipstick remained a reminder of their recent party. Gabriella was struggling to breathe, her mouth hanging open and drool gathering on the luxurious rug below her. Denise felt something sticky and wet on her hand. It was a yellow liquid oozing from Gabriella's body, and it smelled of urine. "Help!" Denise screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Someone please help!" The music continued to pound mercilessly through the room, a cruel counterpoint to the lifeless forms sprawled on the floor. As Gabriella's friends stared in horror at the scene unfolding before them, Denise's mind raced with panic, her thoughts consumed by the dangerous consequences of their actions, consequences that now threatened to destroy everything they held dear. "Please, Gabby," Denise whispered, clutching her friend's limp hand as tears streamed down her face. "Hold on. Just hold on." In another part of the palace, Andrew, a single responder paramedic, was tending to the injured cook who had suffered a minor burn from Gabriella's staged diversion. He had an easy charm that came from his gentle, kind nature and the fact that he was not overly muscular or intimidating in stature. People felt comfortable around him due to the combination of all these qualities. "Ah, that should do it," Andrew said, wrapping a bandage around the servant's wrist with practiced precision. His voice was light and jovial as he tried to alleviate the tense atmosphere. "Careful with those candles next time, all right?" The servant chuckled nervously, nodding in agreement. "Yes, sir. Thank you." "Please call me Andrew," he replied, offering a warm smile. Their light-hearted banter was suddenly interrupted by Denise's frantic cry for help echoing through the hallways. "Help! Someone please help!" Andrew's instincts kicked in immediately, and he excused himself from the servant before gabbing his big red bag with yellow reflective stripes and sprinted toward the source of the distress call. Bursting into the room where Gabriella lay still on the floor, his eyes quickly assessed the dire situation at hand. "Move aside!" he barked authoritatively, pushing through the panicked crowd to reach Gabriella's side. He knelt beside her, his hands swiftly checking for a pulse as he spoke calmly but urgently. "Denise, right? I need you to tell me what happened." She took something," Denise stammered, her voice trembling with fear. "We all did, but she's not—" "Right," Andrew said, his voice even and without judgment. "Can you tell me what substance she took?" As if he was inquiring about her favorite flavor of ice cream. I don't know," Denise lied. "Okay." Andrew took out a flashlight and looked at her eyes. "All right," Andrew nodded, his focus solely on Gabriella as he began administering medical aid. Gabriella's lips were blue, vomit pooling on the expensive rug beneath her as her dim, unseeing eyes stared blankly into the void. "Stay with me, Your Majesty," he murmured, working quickly to stabilize her condition. Andrew took out a ambu bag and put it over Gabriella's face. "Okay, Denise. Are you listening, Denise?" He called to her, getting her attention. "Yes. Look at what I'm doing. I press this ballon to help her breathe. I need you to do this for me in this pace. Watch. 1 and 2. Andrew showed her the pace of squeezing the ballon on the ambu bag. "Now you try. I'll keep an eye and help you, okay?" Andrew said and smiled, trying to convey that she could do this. "Okay?" Denise said in a frail voice. As Andrew turned his attention to the medicine section in his bag, Denise continued to squeeze the ambu bag to help Gabriella breathe as the others watched in terror, struck by the stark reality of their actions. This was no longer just a game, a night of fleeting pleasure. It was a matter of life and death. And as Andrew continued his tireless efforts to help the young queen, they knew that their world would never be the same again. "You're doing well, Denise," Andrew said as he prepared the antidote. As Andrew administered naloxone, the life-saving antidote, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The pounding music had been silenced, leaving only the sound of Gabriella's ragged gasps and the soft murmurs of prayers for her survival. Andrew reached for his radio on his left breast. "First responder 1240 request an ambulance to the Royal Palace, priority 1. Andrew said into the radio and let go, focusing on his patient as the radio replied to his request and said that an ambulance was on its way and would be there in 10 minutes. "Come on, Your Majesty," Andrew whispered hoarsely, his strong hands trembling as he held the syringe steady. "Fight. Is she going to be okay?" Denise asked, her tear-streaked face betraying a mixture of fear and guilt. "Only time will tell," Andrew replied, the weight of the situation evident in his strained expression. The potential consequences of Gabriella's overdose loomed over them all like a dark cloud. The young queen, who had once been a beacon of hope for her people, now lay in grave danger due to the very addiction she sought to escape. And not just her life hung in the balance. The stability of the entire kingdom could be shattered by this single, tragic episode. Finally, mercifully, the convulsions subsided. Gabriella's breathing steadied, though she remained unconscious. Andrew released an audible sigh of relief, but remained vigilant, monitoring her vital signs closely. "Thank you," Denise whispered, her voice thick with gratitude and regret. Andrew glanced up at her, his eyes filled with sadness and understanding. "You didn't know this would happen," he said softly. "But now we must focus on getting her help. Real help. This cannot continue." "Of course," Denise agreed, nodding solemnly. She knew that their reckless behavior had finally caught up with them. Whatever the future held, things would never be the same again. As Andrew continued to tend to Gabriella, the initial shock began to dissipate, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame and guilt among Denise and her friends. They knew that they had played a role in Gabriella's downward spiral, and the gravity of their actions weighed heavily on their hearts. "Andrew," Denise said hesitantly, "what can we do now? How can we help her?" "First, we need to get her to a hospital for further evaluation," Andrew replied, his voice firm but gentle. "Then it's crucial that she receives proper treatment and support for her addiction. And as for you and her other friends, you must be there for her, but also understand that this is a battle she has to fight herself." The room was filled with a somber determination as Gabriella's closest allies realized the magnitude of their responsibility in helping her conquer her demons. The path forward would not be easy, but they knew they had no choice. They owed it to Gabriella and to themselves to right the wrongs of the past and ensure a brighter future for their beloved queen. The siren's blare pierced the air, and soon the ambulance arrived. Andrew stayed at Gabriella's side. His 2 colleagues rolled in a stretcher, and he gave them a brief report and then motioned for them to help lift Gabriella onto the stretcher. Andrew situated her carefully, taking care to make sure she was securely strapped in and covered with a warm blanket. The room seemed to close in around Gabriella, her eyes fluttering open as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The scent of her own vomit, mingled with the burning embers of the fire and the underlying musk of expensive rugs, assaulted her nostrils. Her body ached with the aftermath of convulsions, her muscles tense and sore. "Gabriella," Denise whispered, kneeling by her side, her voice filled with worry and relief. "Thank God you're awake." What happened?" Gabriella rasped, her throat raw from vomiting. Her memory was hazy, her thoughts clouded by the remnants of drug-induced euphoria. "Denise!" Andrew snapped, cutting through their conversation. "We need to get her to the hospital now." "Of course," Denise replied, standing up and moving out of the way as Andrew took charge, as Andrew and his colleagues collected their equipment and began to move Gabriella's stretcher to the awaiting ambulance. "Where are we going?" Gabriella murmured, her head swimming with confusion and fear. "Somewhere safe," Andrew reassured her, his tone firm yet gentle. "You need proper care, Gabriella. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you through this." As they made their way out of the room, Gabriella's vision began to clear.